Billionaire took a helpless pregnant woman to the hospital. What he discovered shocked him. Before I continue on this story, comment and tell me where you are watching from. I have a special gift for you. And make sure you subscribe. Now relax and enjoy the story. The bracelet slipped from her wrist as she collapsed on the sidewalk, and David's world stopped, because he bought that exact same bracelet for his daughter 3 years ago, the day before she died. David Morrison stood frozen on the marble steps of Morrison Industries, his $5,000 suit suddenly feeling like a costume. The woman lay crumpled against the concrete, her dark hair fanned across the pavement, one hand instinctively protecting her swollen belly. The silver bracelet with tiny engraved hearts had rolled toward the gutter, catching the afternoon sun like a signal from another life. Around him, the city moved in its usual rhythm. Pedestrians stepped around the fallen woman with practiced indifference. Car horns blared. The doorman of his building reached for his radio, probably calling security to remove what he'd see as a problem to be solved. But David couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't stop staring at that bracelet. 3 years ago, he'd walked into Tiffany & Company with his daughter Jessica, then 16 and radiant with life. She'd pressed her nose against the glass case, pointing at the delicate silver chain with its row of tiny engraved hearts. "It's perfect, Dad. Not too fancy, not too simple. Just perfect." He'd bought it without hesitation, the way he bought everything for Jessica. Impulsively, generously, desperately trying to make up for all the board meetings, business trips, and missed dinners that success had cost him. She'd worn it every day after that, twisting the hearts between her fingers when she was nervous, the way she did during her college interviews, the way she'd been doing in the passenger seat when the drunk driver ran the red light. "Sir." The doorman's voice cut through his paralysis. "Should I call?" "No." David's voice came out rougher than he intended. He was already moving, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the sidewalk as he knelt beside the woman. Up close, he could see she was young, maybe 25, with exhaustion etched in every line of her face. Her lips were pale, her breathing shallow. "Miss." He touched her shoulder gently. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, and David found himself looking into the deepest brown eyes he'd ever seen. They were clouded with pain and something else, fear. Pure, desperate fear. "My baby," she whispered, her hand pressing against her stomach. "Is my baby okay?" David's throat tightened. He'd built an empire worth billions, commanded boardrooms full of powerful men, negotiated deals that moved markets. But this woman's quiet terror stripped away every defense he'd built since the accident. "We're going to get you help," he said, pulling out his phone. "What's your name?" "Sophia." The word came out like a prayer. "Sophia Kim." As David dialed 911, his eyes kept drifting to the bracelet in the gutter. The coincidence felt impossible, like the universe playing some cruel joke. But there it was, identical to the one buried with his daughter, now somehow connected to this stranger who'd collapsed outside his building. 6 blocks away, in a cramped studio apartment above a Chinese restaurant, Sophia had been pacing for hours before the collapse. The eviction notice lay crumpled on her makeshift table, a piece of plywood balanced on 2 milk crates. 3 days. She had 3 days to find first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit, or she'd be on the street. 8 months pregnant and alone. The morning sickness had finally stopped, but the panic attacks had gotten worse. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jake's face when she'd told him about the pregnancy. The way his expression had shifted from shock to calculation to something that looked almost like disgust. "You're keeping it?" he'd asked, as if she'd announced she was keeping a stray cat. "This is our baby, Jake." "No." He'd backed toward the door of her apartment, shaking his head. "No, this is your problem. I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this." That had been 3 months ago. She hadn't seen him since. The bracelet had been a gift from him during those first magical weeks when she'd thought she was in love. When she'd believed his stories about his family, his dreams, his plans for their future. Before she'd realized that everything he'd told her had been a lie. "It belonged to my sister," he'd said, fastening the delicate chain around her wrist. She would have wanted you to have it. Another lie, probably. But she'd kept wearing it anyway, because it was all she had left of the person she'd thought he was. The cramping had started during her third trip to the employment office that morning. She'd been applying for every job that didn't require experience she didn't have or references she couldn't provide. Receptionist, cleaning lady, anything that would let her work until the baby came. But the cramping had gotten worse as she'd walked back toward her apartment. Sharp, insistent pains that made her stop and breathe through them. By the time she'd reached the gleaming towers of the financial district, she'd been doubled over, clutching her belly and trying not to panic. She'd never been in this part of the city before. The buildings were too tall, the people too polished, the cars too expensive. She'd felt like an intruder in her second-hand maternity clothes and worn sneakers. The last thing she remembered was the ground rushing up to meet her and the sound of her bracelet hitting the pavement. "The ambulance is 2 minutes out," David said, ending the call. He'd moved to shield Sophia from the curious stares of passers-by, his tall frame creating a pocket of privacy around her. "I can't." Sophia struggled to sit up, her face pale with more than just physical pain. "I can't afford an ambulance. I can't afford the hospital." The words hit David like a physical blow. When was the last time he'd thought about the cost of medical care? When was the last time he'd worried about money at all? "Don't worry about that," he said automatically. Sophia's eyes flashed, and for a moment, her fear was replaced by something fiercer. "Easy for you to say. You probably spend more on lunch than I make in a month." She wasn't wrong. David's watch cost more than most people's cars. His suit cost more than her rent. The distance between their worlds was vast enough to swallow entire lives. But something about her defiance, even in her vulnerability, reminded him of Jessica. His daughter had never backed down from a fight, never let anyone, including him, dismiss her concerns. "You're right," he said quietly. "But that doesn't change the fact that you and your baby need help." The ambulance sirens were getting closer. David could see the flashing lights reflecting off the glass towers around them. In minutes, Sophia would be whisked away to get the care she needed, and he'd return to his climate-controlled office, his scheduled meetings, his carefully ordered life. But as he watched her struggle with pride and desperation, as he saw the way her hand never stopped protecting her unborn child, he knew something had shifted. The bracelet in the gutter seemed to pulse with meaning he couldn't yet understand. "What's your last name?" Sophia asked suddenly, her voice barely audible over the approaching sirens. "Morrison," David said. "David Morrison." Recognition flickered across her face, followed immediately by something that might have been horror. "Morrison Industries? You're him. The billionaire." The way she said it made his success sound like a disease. David had grown used to the deference that came with wealth, the way people's voices changed when they realized who he was. But Sophia's reaction was different. She looked at him like he was something to be feared. "I am," he said simply. The ambulance pulled up to the curb, its red and blue lights painting the surrounding buildings in urgent colors. As the paramedics rushed over with their gurney and equipment, David bent down and picked up the bracelet from the gutter. The metal was warm from the sun, and as he held it, he could almost hear Jessica's laugh, could almost see her fingers twisting the tiny hearts. The coincidence still felt impossible, but he slipped the bracelet into his pocket anyway. "Sir, we need to get her to the hospital," one of the paramedics said, already checking Sophia's vital signs. "Are you family?" David looked down at Sophia, who was watching him with those deep brown eyes, still wary but no longer quite so afraid. "No," he said. "I'm just someone who wants to help." As they loaded her into the ambulance, David found himself climbing in beside her, his afternoon of board meetings and profit margins suddenly seeming like artifacts from another life. "What do you think David should do next? Have you ever helped a complete stranger in crisis? Let me know in the comments below." The doors slammed shut, and the ambulance pulled away from the curb, carrying David Morrison into a story he never could have imagined. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with controlled chaos. But David's world had narrowed to the sound of Sophia's labored breathing and the steady beep of the heart monitor they'd connected to her belly. He sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside her bed, still wearing his $1,000 suit, looking completely out of place among the sterile white walls and fluorescent lights. "Why are you still here?" Sophia's voice was soft, but there was steel underneath. She'd been asking the same question in different ways since they'd arrived 40 minutes ago. The doctors had stabilized her, confirmed the baby was okay, but kept her for observation. David had been asking himself the same question. He should have left after making sure she was safe. He had a board meeting in an hour, 3 conference calls after that, and a charity gala tonight that would determine the funding for his foundation's next quarter. His absence was probably causing minor panic among his staff. But every time he moved toward the door, something stopped him. "I don't know," he said honestly, and the admission surprised them both. Sophia studied his face, searching for something. "People like you don't just stick around out of the goodness of their hearts. What do you want?" The question stung because it was fair. David had built his fortune by wanting things, companies, properties, market advantages. He'd learned to calculate the value of everything, to spot the angle in every interaction. But sitting here, watching this woman fight exhaustion and pain while refusing to show weakness, he couldn't identify what he wanted from her. "Maybe I just want to make sure you're okay," he said. "Right." Sophia's laugh was bitter. "The Billionaire with a Heart of Gold. I've seen that movie. It doesn't end well for girls like me." A nurse bustled in, checking Sophia's IV and making notes on her chart. She was an older woman with kind eyes and the efficient movements of someone who'd seen everything. "How's our mama doing?" she asked, adjusting Sophia's blanket. "Fine," Sophia said automatically. The nurse gave her a look that said she'd heard that lie 1,000 times. "Honey, you passed out on the street. Your blood pressure was through the roof, and you're dehydrated. That's not fine." "I just need to rest," Sophia insisted. "Then I can go home." "Home to what?" The nurse's voice was gentle but direct. "The social worker will want to talk to you before you're discharged. Standard procedure for cases like yours." Sophia's face went white. "Cases like mine? Young, alone, no insurance, no support system." The nurse's tone was matter-of-fact, but David could see the kindness in her eyes. "Don't worry, sweetheart. We'll figure something out." After the nurse left, Sophia stared at the ceiling, her jaw clenched so tight David could see the muscles jumping. She was fighting tears and losing. "I'm not a case," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "No," David said quietly. "You're not." The silence stretched between them, filled with the ambient sounds of the hospital. Distant conversations, rolling gurneys, the hum of machinery keeping people alive. David found himself studying Sophia's profile, the determined set of her chin, the way she kept one hand protectively over her belly even in sleep. "Tell me about the baby," he said suddenly. Sophia's eyes snapped to his. "Why?" "Because." David paused, realizing he was venturing into territory he'd avoided for 3 years. "Because I used to be a father. I know what it's like to worry about someone more than yourself." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because her defensive posture softened slightly. "It's a boy," she said, her hand moving in slow circles over her stomach. "He kicks all night, like he's already impatient to get out and start causing trouble." Despite everything, David smiled. Jessica did the same thing. "My wife used to say she was practicing for her dance recitals." "Jessica was your daughter?" David corrected automatically, then caught himself. "Was. She died 3 years ago." The words came out easier than they had in months. Usually, when people learned about Jessica, they immediately shifted into sympathy mode. The careful voice, the sad eyes, the awkward attempts at comfort. But Sophia just nodded, as if she understood that some losses were too big for pleasantries. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "So am I." David pulled the bracelet from his pocket, holding it up to catch the harsh hospital lighting. "She wore one just like this." Sophia's eyes widened. That's mine. It fell off when I..." She reached for it, then stopped. "Jake gave it to me." He said it belonged to his sister. Jake, my ex, the baby's father. Sophia's voice turned flat. He disappeared when he found out I was pregnant. Said he wasn't ready to be a father. David felt something cold settle in his stomach. What was his full name? Jake Morrison. Sophia was still staring at the bracelet. He said his family had money, but that he was trying to make it on his own. Said he didn't want to depend on his father's success. She looked up at David, and he saw the exact moment when the pieces clicked into place. Morrison. Like you. The words hit David like a physical blow. Jake Morrison. His son. The son who died in the passenger seat of David's car 3 years ago, wearing his seatbelt, carrying his wallet, but lying about his identity to a girl he'd gotten pregnant. That's impossible, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Sophia was sitting up now, her brown eyes blazing with something between anger and desperation. Jake Morrison, 24 years old. Dark hair, green eyes, that little scar on his chin from when he fell off his bike as a kid. He told me about that scar. Said his father was too busy with work to take him to get stitches, so his nanny did it. David's world tilted. Jake had gotten that scar when he was 7, racing his bike down the driveway of their estate while David was on a conference call in his study. David had seen the blood, had wanted to drop everything and rush his son to the hospital, but a merger was falling apart, and millions of dollars hung in the balance. He'd let the nanny handle it, just like he'd let the nanny handle so many things. You're lying, he said, but the words came out weak. Am I? Sophia's voice was rising, and a few other patients in the emergency room were starting to stare. He had a tattoo on his shoulder. A compass rose. Said it was to remind him to find his own direction. He drove a black motorcycle, even though his father hated it. He was studying business, but wanted to be a photographer. He had this way of laughing that made you feel like you were the only person in the world. Every detail was correct. Every single one. David felt like he was drowning, like the air in the room had suddenly become too thick to breathe. Jake Morrison died 3 years ago, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Sophia's face crumpled. What? Car accident. He was with me. We were driving to dinner, and a drunk driver ran a red light. David's hands were shaking. He died instantly, along with my daughter. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia stared at him, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been grief. Around them, the hospital continued its routine, but David felt like time had stopped. That's not possible, Sophia said finally. I was with Jake 8 months ago. We were together for 3 months. He was alive. He was. When? David's voice came out harsh. When exactly? Last November through January. We met at a coffee shop near campus. He said he was taking a gap year, figuring things out. Sophia's voice was getting stronger, more certain. He had an apartment near the university. A studio with terrible heating and a view of the parking lot. David's mind raced. November through January. Jake had been dead for 2 years by then. Unless. What did he look like? David asked quietly. I told you. Dark hair, green eyes, about 6 feet tall. He had this birthmark on his wrist shaped like a crescent moon. He used to trace it when he was nervous. David's blood turned to ice. Jake had never had a birthmark, but David knew someone who did. Oh God, he whispered. What? What is it? David pulled out his phone with trembling hands, scrolling through his contacts until he found what he was looking for. A photo from last Christmas, taken at the company holiday party. In the background, barely visible, was a young man with dark hair and green eyes, wearing a server's uniform. Jake Morrison. Not his son. His nephew. His brother's son, who'd taken the name of his dead cousin and used it to reinvent himself. Who'd been working catering jobs to pay for college. Who'd been living in a studio apartment and telling girls he was someone else entirely. This Jake, David said, showing Sophia the photo. Is this him? Sophia looked at the screen, and her face went pale. Yes, that's him. That's the father of my baby. David stared at the photo, his mind reeling. His nephew. His brother's son. The boy he'd barely acknowledged at family gatherings, who'd grown up in the shadow of David's success and his brother's bitterness. The boy who'd gotten this woman pregnant and then disappeared. The boy who was carrying on the Morrison name in the worst possible way. "I need to make some calls," David said, standing abruptly. "Wait." Sophia grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Don't you dare leave me here with nothing but questions. If you know who Jake really is, if you know where he is, I have a right to know." David looked down at her, at this fierce, broken woman carrying his nephew's child, and felt something shift inside his chest. She was right. She did have a right to know. But more than that, she had a right to be protected. And for the first time in 3 years, David Morrison felt like he had a purpose beyond profit margins and board meetings. "You're right," he said quietly. "You do have a right to know. And I'm going to help you find him." What do you think David should do about his nephew Jake? Should he confront him, or focus on helping Sophia first? Share your thoughts in the comments. The heart monitor continued its steady beep, but David could hear something else now. The sound of his carefully controlled world cracking open, one truth at a time. David stepped into the hallway outside Sophia's room, his phone already buzzing with missed calls from his assistant. The familiar weight of his business world pressed against him. Meetings that couldn't wait, decisions that affected thousands of employees, deals worth millions hanging in the balance. He'd built his entire life around control, around knowing exactly where he stood and what came next. Now everything felt like shifting sand. "Mr. Morrison?" His assistant's voice was tight with barely controlled panic when he answered. "The Japanese investors are waiting in the conference room. The Henderson acquisition papers need your signature in 20 minutes, and the mayor's office has called 3 times about tonight's gala." "Cancel everything," David said, the words coming out before he'd fully decided to say them. "Sir? Did you say cancel?" "Because the Tokyo deal alone represents." "I know what it represents, Jennifer. Cancel it anyway." He hung up before she could protest further and immediately dialed another number. "Morrison Residence," came the crisp voice of his brother's housekeeper. "Is Robert available?" "I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison, but Mr. Robert is in Seattle on business. He won't return until Friday." Of course he was. Robert had spent the last 20 years traveling constantly, building his own smaller empire while nursing a grudge against David's success. Their relationship had been strained since their father's death, when David had inherited control of the company that Robert felt should have been split equally between them. "What about Jake? Is Jake there?" A pause. "Young Mr. Jake moved out 6 months ago, sir. He said he wanted to experience independence." 6 months ago. Right around the time Sophia would have realized she was pregnant. David ended the call and leaned against the hospital wall, watching the steady stream of people moving through the corridor. Doctors with purposeful strides, nurses carrying charts, families huddled together in worry and hope. Real people dealing with real problems while he'd spent years insulated in his tower of success. When he returned to Sophia's room, she was sitting up in bed, fully dressed in her worn maternity clothes. Her face was set with determination that he was beginning to recognize as her default expression when cornered. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked. "Home," she said, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. "I've answered your questions. You've satisfied your curiosity about Jake. We're done here. Sophia, you can't just..." "Can't what?" "Leave." She stood, swaying slightly before catching herself on the bed rail. "Watch me." David moved to steady her, but she pulled away from his touch. "The doctor said you need to rest. Your blood pressure." "My blood pressure is fine. And even if it wasn't, I can't afford to stay here playing rich man's charity case while my real life falls apart." Sophia's voice was getting louder, drawing glances from passing staff. "I have 3 days to find a new place to live, remember? 3 days to figure out how to survive until this baby comes. I can help with that." "No." The word came out sharp and final. "You can't." David felt frustration building in his chest. For 3 years, he'd solved problems by throwing money at them. Donated millions to hospitals, funded scholarships, built housing for the homeless. Writing checks had become his way of engaging with the world without actually having to be vulnerable in it. Why not? I have resources. Because I'm not your dead daughter. Sophia's voice cracked on the words, and suddenly the fight went out of her. She sank back onto the bed, her hands shaking. I'm not Jessica. I'm not your second chance or your redemption project. I'm just a girl who made bad choices and got abandoned by someone who shares your name. The words hit David harder than any business rival's attack ever had. Because she was right. Part of him had been looking at her and seeing Jessica. Young, vulnerable, in need of protection he'd failed to provide. You're right, he said quietly. I'm sorry. Sophia looked up at him, surprise flickering across her face as if she'd expected him to argue. But that doesn't change the fact that Jake is my nephew, David continued. And it doesn't change the fact that he got you pregnant and then ran away when you needed him most. So what? You're going to track him down and force him to be a father? Make him love me. Sophia's laugh was bitter. That's not how it works. You can't buy love, no matter how many billions you have. David sat down in the plastic chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 52 years. No, you can't. The admission hung between them, heavy with 3 years of grief and regret. Outside the room, a baby was crying somewhere down the hall, and David saw Sophia's hand move instinctively to her belly. I don't want your help, she said, but her voice lacked the fire it had held moments before. I know. I don't trust you. I know that too. People like you always want something in return. There's always a catch. David thought about his empty mansion, his perfectly organized life, his calendar full of obligations that meant nothing to anyone who mattered. Maybe the catch is that I need to help you more than you need my help. Sophia studied his face, searching for deception or manipulation. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Probably. Despite herself, the corner of Sophia's mouth twitched upward. You're not what I expected. Neither are you. A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Ms. Kim, Dr. Peterson would like to see you before discharge. Just to go over your care instructions. After the nurse left, Sophia stood again, this time more steadily. I'm going home, Mr. Morrison. Thank you for helping me get to the hospital. Thank you for telling me the truth about Jake. But this is where it ends. David watched her gather her purse, a worn cloth bag that had seen better years. Everything about her radiated pride wrapped around desperation, strength masking fear. She was walking away from the only person who could easily solve her immediate problems because accepting help felt like losing herself. He understood that feeling better than she could know. The bracelet, he said as she reached the door. Sophia turned back, her hand extended. Right. I almost forgot. David looked down at the silver chain in his palm, at the tiny engraved hearts that had meant everything to Jessica. For 3 years, he'd carried the weight of every choice that had led to that car accident, every moment of inattention that had cost him his family. But this bracelet had found its way to Sophia for a reason. Jake had given it to her, which meant Jake had taken it from David's house. From Jessica's room, probably, where David kept her things exactly as she'd left them. His nephew had stolen his dead daughter's jewelry to impress a girl he had no intention of staying with. Keep it, David said, closing Sophia's fingers around the bracelet. I can't. It belonged to your daughter. Jessica would have liked you, David said, and realized it was true. She would have wanted you to have it. Sophia's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. This doesn't change anything. I know. I'm still leaving. I know. And you're not going to follow me or try to rescue me or any of that creepy stalker stuff rich guys do in movies. David smiled despite everything. I promise. Sophia nodded and walked toward the door, then stopped without turning around. The baby's due in 6 weeks. I know. If something happens to me, if I can't. She took a shaky breath. Someone should know he exists. Someone should know Jake's son is in the world. David's throat tightened. Someone will know. Sophia walked out of the room without looking back, leaving David alone with the steady beep of medical equipment and the sound of his own heart breaking open for the first time in 3 years. He pulled out his phone and called his driver. "Thomas, I need you to follow someone. Discreetly. Make sure she gets home safely. And then I want to know everything about where she lives, what she needs, and how bad her situation really is." "Sir." "And Thomas, if she spots you, you're fired." David ended the call and stared out the window at the city beyond. Somewhere out there, his nephew was living a lie while the woman carrying his child struggled alone. Somewhere out there, Sophia was fighting battles she shouldn't have to fight by herself. For 3 years, David had hidden in his tower of success, telling himself that work was enough, that achievement could fill the hole left by loss. But sitting in this hospital room, watching Sophia walk away with her fierce pride and desperate circumstances, he felt something stirring that he'd thought died with Jessica. The need to protect someone. The need to matter to someone who mattered to him. Do you think David should respect Sophia's wishes and stay away, or is he right to want to help her? What would you do in his situation? Let me know your thoughts. Whether Sophia wanted his help or not, David Morrison was done hiding from the world. It was time to step back into the messiness of real life, starting with finding his nephew and ending with making sure Sophia and her baby had everything they needed to survive, even if it meant she'd never forgive him for it. David's phone buzzed at 2:47 a.m., jolting him awake in his study where he'd fallen asleep over financial reports he couldn't concentrate on. Thomas's name flashed on the screen. "Sir, you need to get down here. Now." "What's wrong?" "The building she lives in, there's been a fire. Everyone's been evacuated. She's..." Thomas paused. "She's sitting on the curb with nowhere to go." David was already reaching for his jacket. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. The drive through the empty city streets felt endless. David's mind raced with worst-case scenarios while his hands gripped the steering wheel tight enough to hurt. When he pulled up to the scene, he could see the aftermath: fire trucks, flashing lights, and a small crowd of displaced residents clustered on the sidewalk with whatever belongings they'd managed to grab. He spotted Sophia immediately. She sat on the concrete curb, still in the same clothes from the hospital, holding a single garbage bag that apparently contained everything she'd been able to save. Her face was streaked with soot and tears she was trying to hide. David approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Sophia." She looked up, and for a moment, surprise flickered across her exhaustion. "What are you doing here?" David hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I had someone watching to make sure you got home safely. When the fire started, you had me followed?" Sophia struggled to her feet, swaying slightly. "Are you kidding me right now? I was worried about you. So you hired someone to spy on me?" Her voice was rising, drawing attention from other evacuees. "I told you I didn't want your help." A fire chief approached them, clipboard in hand and patience clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, I need to know where you'll be staying tonight. We can't clear the scene until everyone has somewhere to go." Sophia's mouth opened, then closed. David could see her mental calculations: shelters that might be full, friends she was too proud to call, options that didn't exist. "She'll be staying with me," David said. "No, I won't," Sophia shot back immediately. The fire chief looked between them with the expression of someone who'd dealt with too many domestic disputes during emergency situations. "Look, folks, I don't care where you work this out, but I need an address for our records." "The women's shelter on 5th Street, Sophia said. "That's been at capacity for 2 weeks, the fire chief replied. "Try again." David watched Sophia's face crumble slightly before she rebuilt her walls. She was 8 months pregnant, homeless, exhausted, and running out of pride to burn for warmth. "My driver is here," David said quietly. "Let him take you somewhere warm while you figure out your next move. That's all I'm asking." Sophia looked around at the chaos, at the other residents who were climbing into cars with family or friends, at the smoking building that had been her home. Her hand moved to her belly, and David saw the moment when the baby's needs outweighed her stubborn independence. "Fine," she said, "but just for tonight. Underscore 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 underscore. The drive to David's estate was silent except for the soft hum of the Mercedes and Sophia's occasional sharp intake of breath when the baby kicked. David found himself glancing at her reflection in the window, noting the way she held herself rigidly upright despite her obvious exhaustion. When they pulled through the iron gates of his property, Sophia's eyes widened despite herself. The mansion sat at the end of a circular drive, its Georgian facade lit by subtle landscape lighting that made it look like something from a magazine. "This is where you live?" she asked. "Yes." "By yourself?" David thought of the empty rooms, the staff quarters that housed people who cleaned spaces he rarely used, the silence that echoed through halls designed for a family. "Yes." Inside, Sophia stood in the marble foyer, her garbage bag clutched in both hands, looking smaller and more vulnerable than she had even in the hospital. David's housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, appeared as if summoned by telepathy. "Sir? Is everything all right?" "Mrs. Patterson, this is Sophia. She'll be staying in the blue guest room tonight. Could you make sure she has everything she needs?" Mrs. Patterson, who had worked for the Morrison family for 30 years and had helped raise both David and his brother, took one look at Sophia's condition and pregnancy and shifted into the efficient mothering mode that had gotten David through his own difficult nights as a child. "Of course. Miss, let me show you upstairs. Have you eaten? When did you last have a proper meal?" Sophia looked overwhelmed by the sudden attention. "I'm fine. I just need somewhere to sleep." "Nonsense. You're eating for two." Mrs. Patterson was already guiding Sophia toward the stairs. "I'll bring up some soup and sandwiches. Do you have any food allergies?" As their voices faded upstairs, David found himself alone in his foyer, unsure what to do with himself. For 3 years, his evening routine had been predictable. Dinner alone in his study, review of the next day's schedule, perhaps a glass of scotch while reading financial reports. His house had been a sanctuary of controlled solitude. Now, with Sophia upstairs, everything felt different. The silence seemed less peaceful and more empty. The space felt too big, too cold, too much like a museum and not enough like a home. He poured himself that scotch and stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Jake was probably sleeping peacefully, unaware that the woman carrying his child had just lost everything she owned. The thought made David's jaw clench. Footsteps on the stairs interrupted his brooding. Sophia appeared in the doorway, wearing what looked like one of Mrs. Patterson's spare nightgowns, her dark hair damp from a shower. "I wanted to thank you," she said, not quite meeting his eyes, "for tonight. I know I wasn't exactly gracious about accepting help." "You don't need to thank me." "Yeah, I do." Sophia moved further into the room, taking in the leather-bound books, the antique furniture, the family photos on the mantel. "This is a beautiful home." "It's too big," David said, then wondered why he'd admitted that. Sophia picked up a framed photo from the side table. David with Jessica and his late wife, taken the Christmas before the accident. Everyone was laughing at something off camera, their faces bright with joy and possibility. "She looks like you," Sophia said softly. "Jessica. She has your eyes." David moved to stand beside her, looking at the photo he both treasured and avoided. "That was our last Christmas together. Tell me about her." The request surprised him. Most people avoided asking about Jessica, afraid of saying the wrong thing or opening wounds they couldn't help heal. But Sophia's voice held genuine curiosity, not pity. "She was stubborn," David said, a smile tugging at his lips despite everything. "Brilliant and stubborn and completely fearless. She wanted to be a doctor, specifically a pediatric surgeon. Said if she was going to save lives, she might as well start with the ones that had the most left to live." "She sounds amazing." She was. David set down his scotch, suddenly not wanting the alcohol between him and the memory. "She used to wait up for me when I worked late, no matter how many times I told her to go to bed. She'd fall asleep on the couch in my study, and I'd carry her upstairs. I bet she loved that. I think she pretended to be asleep sometimes, just so I'd carry her. David's voice caught slightly. I should have carried her more when she was awake. Sophia was quiet for a moment, studying the photo. You know what I think? What? I think she knew you loved her. Kids always know, even when their parents think they're screwing it up. David looked at Sophia, this young woman who'd lost everything tonight, who was facing single motherhood with no resources and no support, who had every reason to be bitter about absent fathers and broken promises. Yet here she was, offering comfort to a man who had everything except the one thing that mattered. How do you know that? He asked. Sophia's hand moved to her belly. Because I already love this baby more than anything in the world, and he's not even here yet. If I feel this way now, I can't imagine how much deeper it gets once you meet them, hold them, watch them grow up. That kind of love doesn't just disappear because you made mistakes. David felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he'd built around his grief that was finally beginning to crumble. I was supposed to protect her. You did protect her. For 16 years, you protected her. One moment of something beyond your control doesn't erase all of that. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the soft tick of the antique clock on the mantel. Outside, the city continued its restless movement, but inside this room, time felt suspended. The baby's kicking, Sophia said suddenly, her hand pressed against her side. Does it hurt? Not exactly. It's more like... She paused, searching for words. Like he's reminding me he's there. Like he's saying, hey mom, don't forget about me. Without thinking, David asked, can I? Sophia hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. David placed his hand gently against her belly, and immediately felt the strong, insistent movement of new life. The sensation hit him like an electric shock. This tiny person, already fighting to exist, already making his presence known. He's strong, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. He has to be. Sophia's eyes were bright with unshed tears. He's going to be born into a pretty messed up situation. Maybe not as messed up as you think, David said, and realized he meant it. They stood there for several minutes, David's hand on Sophia's belly, feeling the movements of his nephew's child, this unexpected connection between his past and her future. For the first time in 3 years, David felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. You should get some rest, David said finally, though he was reluctant to break the moment. Yeah. Sophia covered his hand with hers for just a second before stepping away. Thank you. For everything. As she headed toward the stairs, David called after her. Sophia, you're not alone anymore. Whatever happens next, you're not facing it alone. She paused without turning around, her shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. Good night, David. After she disappeared upstairs, David remained in the room, his hands still warm from the contact with new life. Tomorrow, he would have to face the reality of what came next. Finding Jake, sorting out Sophia's situation, figuring out how to help without overstepping. But tonight, for the first time since the accident, his house didn't feel empty. Tonight, he wasn't just David Morrison, the successful but isolated billionaire. He was someone who mattered to someone who mattered. It was a start. David woke to the sound of voices drifting from the kitchen, Mrs. Patterson's gentle fussing and Sophia's polite but firm protests. Sunlight streamed through his bedroom windows, and for a moment, he felt disoriented. He'd slept past dawn for the first time in years, his usual 5 a.m. wake-up call forgotten in the unfamiliar peace of knowing someone else was in the house. When he made his way downstairs, he found Sophia at the kitchen island, wearing clothes that Mrs. Patterson had clearly provided, a soft blue maternity dress that actually fit her properly. She was methodically working her way through a plate of eggs and toast while Mrs. Patterson hovered nearby, refilling her orange juice glass. Good morning, David said, accepting the coffee Mrs. Patterson handed him without being asked. Morning, Sophia replied, but her voice was distant. She'd rebuilt her walls overnight, her expression carefully neutral. I called the shelter. They have an opening this afternoon. You don't have to leave, David said quickly. Yes, I do. Sophia's tone was final. This was one night. That was the deal. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat pointedly. If I may, sir, perhaps Miss Sophia would like to see the nursery before she goes? David nearly choked on his coffee. Mrs. Patterson. Nursery. Sophia's fork paused halfway to her mouth. The room we prepared for Master Jake when he was born, Mrs. Patterson continued, ignoring David's warning look. Mr. David's brother lived here for the first few years of the boys' lives, you see. It's been preserved exactly as it was. David felt heat rising in his face. The nursery was part of the wing he'd had sealed off after Jessica's death, rooms full of memories he couldn't bear to face. That's not necessary. I'd like to see it, Sophia said quietly. Mrs. Patterson beamed triumphantly and led them through the house to a section David hadn't entered in 3 years. As they climbed the back staircase, she kept up a steady stream of chatter about the house's history, the Morrison family traditions, the children who'd played in these halls. Master David and Master Robert were so different as boys, she was saying. David was always serious, always working on some project or another. But Robert was pure mischief. And when little Jake came along, he was just like his father, into everything, charming his way out of trouble. They stopped in front of a white door adorned with hand-painted letters spelling out Jake. Mrs. Patterson turned the handle, and David's chest tightened as the door swung open. The nursery was a time capsule. Pale yellow walls, white furniture that had been built to last generations, shelves lined with toys and books. Sunlight filtered through curtains printed with alphabet blocks, casting warm patterns across a rocking chair where David's mother had once sung lullabies. But it was the photographs that made David's breath catch. Mrs. Patterson had clearly been maintaining this room despite his instructions to leave the sealed wing alone. The pictures showed the progression of Jake's early childhood. A baby in David's arms, a toddler learning to walk between the two brothers, a little boy blowing out candles on his 3rd birthday cake. In every photo, Jake looked exactly like the young man Sophia had described. The same dark hair, the same green eyes, the same mischievous smile that had gotten him out of trouble more times than anyone could count. That's him, Sophia whispered, pointing to a photo of 5-year-old Jake on David's shoulders. That's Jake. But he's so young here. This was before they moved away, Mrs. Patterson explained. Master Robert decided he wanted his independence when Jake started school. They moved to the other side of the city. David remembered that fight. Robert had accused him of trying to control Jake's upbringing, of making decisions about his nephew's future without consulting him. There had been bitter words about David thinking his money gave him the right to run everyone's lives. Robert had been right, of course. David had been trying to control everything, the way he always did. But he'd told himself it was for Jake's own good, that the boy deserved the best schools, the best opportunities, the best of everything David's wealth could provide. Robert wanted Jake to have a normal childhood, David said, more to himself than to the others. Said growing up in this house would spoil him, make him think he was entitled to things he hadn't earned. Sophia picked up a small wooden train from the toy shelf, turning it over in her hands. Jake told me his father was strict. Said he had to work for everything, that there were no handouts in his family. Robert was determined to raise Jake differently than we were raised, David continued. Our father gave us everything except his time and attention. Robert swore he wouldn't make the same mistakes. But he did make mistakes, Mrs. Patterson said softly. Just different ones. David looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Master Robert was so afraid of spoiling Jake that he went too far the other way. The boy was never allowed to accept help from family, never allowed to benefit from the Morrison name. When he graduated high school and wanted to go to college, Master Robert insisted he pay his own way entirely. That builds character, David said, but the words felt hollow. Perhaps, but it also builds resentment. Mrs. Patterson straightened a picture frame with gentle care. Jake came to see you several times over the years. Did you know that? He'd wait in the lobby of your building, asking to speak with you. Your security always turned him away. David felt like he'd been punched. What? When? The last time was about a year ago. He told the guard he was your nephew and that it was important. The guard checked with your assistant, who said you weren't taking family visits. The room seemed to spin around David. He remembered Jennifer mentioning something about a young man claiming to be related to him, but he dismissed it as another scheme to get access to his money. He'd been so focused on protecting himself from people who wanted to use him that he'd shut out his own family. I didn't know, he said weakly. Sophia was studying a photo of teenage Jake with Robert, both of them standing beside a beat-up motorcycle. He told me his father hated that bike, said it represented everything reckless and irresponsible about his generation. Robert called me about that motorcycle, David remembered suddenly. Said Jake had bought it with money from some part-time job and that he was going to get himself killed riding it around the city. Robert wanted me to refuse to pay for Jake's insurance unless he got rid of it. Did you? I stayed out of it. Told Robert it was his decision to make. David's voice was bitter with regret. I was so tired of fighting with my brother about Jake that I just withdrew. Stopped trying to be part of his life. Sophia set down the wooden train and moved to the window, looking out at the expansive grounds. So Jake grew up feeling abandoned by his rich uncle and controlled by his father. No wonder he started lying about who he was. The bracelet, David said suddenly, pieces clicking into place. How did he get Jessica's bracelet? Mrs. Patterson's face flushed. I'm afraid that might have been my fault, sir. After the accident, when you sealed off this wing, Jake came by one day asking if he could have something to remember Miss Jessica by. They'd been close when they were children, before the family split apart. I gave him the bracelet from her jewelry box. David stared at her, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. You gave him Jessica's bracelet? He was grieving too, sir. He loved that little girl like a sister. I thought it would comfort him. So he took my dead daughter's jewelry and used it to seduce girls? David's voice was rising. He gave Sophia something that belonged to Jessica, lied about where it came from, and then abandoned her? Maybe he didn't know what else to do with it, Sophia said quietly. Maybe giving it to someone he cared about felt like honoring Jessica's memory. David turned to stare at her. You're defending him? I'm trying to understand him. Sophia's hand moved to her belly. Because this baby is going to ask questions about his father someday, and I'd rather have answers that don't make Jake sound like a complete monster. The simple wisdom of her words cut through David's anger. She was right, of course. Jake wasn't a monster. He was a young man who'd made terrible choices, influenced by years of family dysfunction that David had helped create. He worked for my company, David said suddenly. The catering job at the Christmas party. Robert must have gotten him that position, probably told him not to mention the family connection. He was ashamed, Sophia realized. Ashamed of needing the work, ashamed of the family connection, ashamed of everything. So he reinvented himself. And when you got pregnant, that fantasy fell apart, David continued. He couldn't pretend to be someone else's son when he was about to become a father himself. Mrs. Patterson was quietly organizing the photo albums, but David could see tears in her eyes. This family used to be so close, she said. Before the money got in the way, before the pride and the stubbornness. These boys loved each other once. David looked around the nursery, at the evidence of happier times, and felt the full weight of 3 years of isolation pressing down on him. He'd lost Jessica and his wife in the accident, but he'd also lost his brother and nephew through his own choices. The walls he'd built, the distance he'd maintained, the assumption that money could replace connection. I need to find him, David said. I need to find Jake and make this right. We need to find him, Sophia corrected. This baby deserves to know his father, even if his father is complicated. David met her eyes and saw determination there, but also something else, forgiveness. Not for Jake's abandonment, but for the broken family dynamics that had shaped it. She was offering him a chance to be part of the solution instead of just another part of the problem. Together, he agreed. As they left the nursery, David felt like he was carrying both the weight of his family's fractured history and the possibility of healing it. Jake was out there somewhere, probably still running from the truth, still believing he had to choose between his family's wealth and his own integrity. But now David had a reason to chase him down that went beyond duty or obligation. He had Sophia, and he had his unborn nephew, and for the first time in years, he had hoped that the Morrison family story didn't have to end in tragedy. 3 days later, David found Sophia in his library, surrounded by baby-name books Mrs. Patterson had mysteriously produced from somewhere in the house's vast storage. She was curled up in the leather armchair by the window, a cup of tea steaming on the side table, looking more relaxed than he'd seen her since they'd met. "Any front runners?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "I'm partial to Alexander," she said, not looking up from the book. "Strong name. Classic. And he can choose what to call himself when he gets older. Alex, Xander, even Sandy if he's feeling rebellious." David smiled. Jessica went through a phase where she insisted everyone call her Jess the Great. She was 8 and had just learned about Alexander the Great in school. "Did you do it?" "For 6 months, yes." Even introduced her that way at parent-teacher conferences. David's eyes crinkled at the memory. "Her teacher thought I was the most indulgent father in the world. Were you?" The question was casual, but David heard the deeper inquiry beneath it. Sophia was trying to understand him, to figure out what kind of man he really was beneath the wealth and the walls. "Probably," he admitted. "I missed so much of her childhood because of work. Saying yes to the little things felt like the least I could do." Sophia marked her place in the book and set it aside. "Can I ask you something personal? Everything about this situation is personal. Why didn't you remarry? After your wife died, I mean. You're successful, attractive, probably have women throwing themselves at you constantly." David was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth to share. "Because I was afraid I'd fail them too." "That's not failure, David. What happened to your family was an accident." "Was it?" David stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where Jessica used to play. "I was driving that night because I'd insisted we all go to dinner together. Family time, I called it. But really, I was trying to prove something, to myself, to them, to anyone who thought I was a terrible father and husband." Sophia waited, sensing there was more. "We'd been fighting," David continued. "Catherine had been asking me to cut back on work, to be more present. Jessica was starting to apply to colleges, and she wanted me involved in the process. But I had this massive deal closing, and I kept putting them off. So you planned a family dinner." "I planned a family dinner at the most expensive restaurant in the city, during rush hour, in a car that cost more than most people's houses." David's voice was bitter with self-recrimination. "I was showing off instead of just being with them. If we'd stayed home, if we'd ordered pizza and sat around the kitchen table like Catherine wanted, they'd still be alive," Sophia finished softly. "Yes." Sophia struggled to her feet, her movements careful but determined. She crossed to where David stood and placed her hand on his arm. "You know what I think," she said. "That I'm an idiot who destroyed his family? I think you're a man who loved his family so much that you're torturing yourself with impossible what-ifs." Sophia's voice was gentle but firm. "I think Jessica and Catherine knew you loved them, even when work got in the way. And I think they'd be heartbroken to know you've spent 3 years punishing yourself for something that was never your fault." David looked down at her, this young woman who barely knew him, but somehow saw through his guilt to something deeper. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "See the best in people when they've given you every reason not to." Sophia's smile was sad but warm. "Experience, I guess. I've had a lot of practice looking for the good in people who've disappointed me." The comment hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of her own losses. David realized how little he actually knew about Sophia's life before Jake, before the pregnancy, before their paths had crossed. "Tell me about your family," he said. "What family?" Sophia's laugh was hollow. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 12. After that, it was foster homes until I aged out of the system at 18. David felt his chest tighten. "I'm sorry." "It's okay." "Well, no, it's not okay, but it's finished, you know? You learn to build your own family from the people who choose to stay. Is that what Jake was? Family? Sophia considered the question seriously. I thought so. For a while, he made me feel like I belonged somewhere. Like someone had chosen me. She shrugged. Turns out I was wrong. His loss, David said, and meant it. Maybe. Or maybe we were both just looking for something the other person couldn't give us. Sophia moved back to her chair, settling in with obvious relief. Jake wanted to be someone else, and I wanted someone to want me as I am. That's not exactly a recipe for success. David found himself studying her profile, the way the afternoon light caught the gold highlights in her dark hair, the unconscious grace with which she moved despite her advanced pregnancy. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was real in a way that most people in his world weren't. No artifice, no agenda, just honest vulnerability wrapped in fierce strength. You know, he said carefully, you don't have to go to the shelter. Sophia's eyes sharpened. David, hear me out. Mrs. Patterson loves having someone to fuss over. The house has more empty rooms than I know what to do with. And frankly, I sleep better knowing you're safe. Why? The question was direct, challenging. Why do you care what happens to me? David sat back down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Because for the first time in 3 years, I feel useful. Because helping you feels like honoring Jessica's memory instead of just mourning it. Because, he paused, searching for words that wouldn't scare her away. Because you make this house feel like a home instead of a museum. Sophia was quiet for a long time, her hand moving in slow circles over her belly. What happens when we find Jake? I don't know. What happens when the baby comes? I don't know that either. What happens if this goes sideways and we end up hating each other? David smiled despite the gravity of the question. Then at least we'll have tried something real instead of hiding behind safe choices. That's a terrible answer. It's an honest answer. Sophia picked up her tea and took a slow sip, studying David over the rim of the cup. I've never lived anywhere like this. I don't know how to be around people who have staff and drivers and rooms they don't even use. I've never lived with a pregnant woman who calls me out on my nonsense and makes me remember what it's like to care about someone, David countered. I'd say we're even. Despite herself, Sophia laughed. You really are different than I expected. So are you. Okay, she said suddenly. Okay. I'll stay. For now. Until we figure out what comes next. Sophia held up a finger. But I'm not your charity case, and I'm not your replacement daughter. I'm just me. Complicated, stubborn me. I wouldn't want you any other way. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the soft tick of the antique clock and the distant sound of Mrs. Patterson humming in the kitchen. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the library in warm golden light. Alexander Morrison, Sophia said suddenly. What? If the baby takes Jake's last name, he'd be Alexander Morrison. It has a nice ring to it, don't you think? David felt something warm unfurl in his chest. The idea of a new Morrison baby, of new life carrying on the family name, of hope emerging from the wreckage of the past 3 years. It was almost too much to bear. It's perfect, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I was thinking, Sophia continued, when he's old enough to understand, I want to tell him about Jessica. About his cousin who would have loved him. David's throat closed completely. The thought of Jessica's memory living on through this child, of her spirit somehow touching the next generation, felt like a gift he didn't deserve but desperately needed. She would have, he managed. She would have spoiled him rotten. Good, Sophia said fiercely. Every kid should have someone who spoils them rotten. As the last light faded from the sky, David found himself thinking about the twists of fate that had brought them together. Jake's deception, the fire, the bracelet that had started it all. Each event had seemed like a disaster at the time, but together they'd led to this moment. To Sophia curled up in his chair, planning a future that included him. To the possibility of redemption, of family, of love in its most unexpected form. For the first time since the accident, David Morrison felt like he was exactly where he belonged. David's private investigator called on a Tuesday morning while Sophia was in the garden, reading to her belly in the sunshine. David watched her through his study window as he answered the phone, noting how the past week had brought color back to her cheeks and a genuine smile to her face. "I found him," the investigator said without preamble. "Jake Morrison. He's been working under his real name at a photography studio downtown. Apparently, he's been saving money to move to Portland." David's stomach tightened. Portland. Gets better. He's got a plane ticket for Thursday. One way. Thursday was 2 days away. David hung up and stared at the address written on his notepad, feeling the weight of decisions he'd have to make. They'd found Jake, but now what? Confront him? Expose his lies? Force him to face the woman he'd abandoned? He was still wrestling with the options when Sophia appeared in his study doorway, glowing from her time in the sun. "Who was on the phone?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk with the careful movements of someone 8.5 months pregnant. "My investigator. He found Jake." Sophia's hand stilled on her belly. "Where?" "Downtown. He's working at a photography studio." David paused, then delivered the harder news. "He's planning to leave town. Day after tomorrow." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Sophia's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, hurt, anger, and finally, something that looked like resignation. "Of course he is," she said quietly. "Can't have any loose ends following him to his new life. We can stop him. We can go there today, confront him." "No." Sophia's voice was firm. "Not we. Me. This is my conversation to have." David felt panic rise in his chest. "Sophia, you shouldn't face him alone." "Why not? I faced his abandonment alone. I faced homelessness alone. I faced everything else alone." Her voice was getting stronger, more determined. "I think I can handle one conversation with the father of my child. But what if he what? Hurts me? Disappoints me?" Sophia's laugh was bitter. "David, he already did the worst thing he could do. He left. Everything else is just details." David stood and moved around his desk, his protective instincts warring with his respect for her independence. "Let me come with you. I'll stay in the car, but I want to be there if you need me." Sophia studied his face, seeing the genuine concern there. "Why does this matter so much to you?" "Because." David struggled with words that felt too big, too complicated. "Because you matter to me. Because that baby matters to me. Because Jake is my family, and what he did was wrong, and I need him to know that." "Your family," Sophia repeated slowly. "David, what exactly do you think is going to happen here? You confront Jake, he sees the error of his ways, and suddenly we're all one big happy family." "I don't know what I think will happen." "Well, I do." Sophia pushed herself to her feet, her movements sharp with agitation. "Jake is going to make excuses. He's going to blame his father, his upbringing, the pressure of the Morrison name. He's going to say he panicked, that he wasn't ready, that he never meant for things to go this far." David watched her pace, recognizing the signs of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation in her head 1,000 times. "And then," Sophia continued, "he's going to offer me money. Probably a lot of money, because that's how your family solves problems, isn't it? Write a check, make it go away, pretend it never happened." The accusation hit David like a slap. "That's not fair. Isn't it?" Sophia turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "What exactly have you been doing for the past week? Taking care of my housing, my food, my medical expenses? Making sure I'm comfortable and safe while you decide what to do about your family's mess. That's different. I care about you. Do you? Or do you care about fixing the problem I represent?" David felt the conversation spiraling away from him, but he couldn't find the words to stop it. "Sophia, that's not." "I've been thinking about this," she interrupted. "Really thinking. And I realized something. You've never asked me what I want. Not once. You've asked about the baby, about Jake, about my living situation. But you've never asked what I actually want for my life." The words hung in the air between them, and David realized with growing horror that she was right. He'd been so focused on solving her problems that he'd never considered she might want to solve them herself. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "I want to raise my son without having to be grateful to anyone for the privilege. I want him to know his father's name without having to be ashamed of it. I want to build a life that's mine, not something handed to me by people who feel sorry for me." David felt something cold settling in his stomach. "And you think I'm standing in the way of that?" "I think you're a good man who's trying to fix something that can't be fixed," Sophia said, her voice softer now but no less determined. "I think you're trying to save me the same way you couldn't save Jessica." The comparison was like a knife to the chest. "That's not what this is. Isn't it?" David, look around. "You've installed me in your house, surrounded me with luxury, made sure I want for nothing. You've given me everything except what I actually need. Which is the chance to stand on my own 2 feet. David stared at her, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath him. Everything he'd thought he understood about their relationship, about what she needed from him, was crumbling. "I'm trying to help you," he said weakly. "I know, and I'm grateful. But help and rescue aren't the same thing." Sophia moved toward the door, then stopped. "I'm going to see Jake. Alone. And after I do, I'm moving out. Sophia, please." "This has been wonderful," she said, and he could hear tears in her voice even though she wasn't crying. "Living here, feeling safe, feeling cared for. It's been like a fairy tale. But fairy tales don't last, David. And I need to live in the real world. This is the real world. What we have, what we've built. What we've built is beautiful and temporary." Sophia's hand moved to her belly. "But my son deserves more than temporary. He deserves a mother who knows how to survive without depending on other people's charity." "It's not charity," David said desperately. "I care about you." I know," Sophia said softly. "That's what makes this so hard." She left the study, and David heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard her moving around in the guest room that had become her sanctuary. He stood frozen in place, replaying the conversation, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. An hour later, Sophia appeared in his study doorway again, wearing her old clothes, the ones she'd been wearing the night of the fire. The maternity dress Mrs. Patterson had given her was folded in her arms. "I called a cab," she said. "I'm going to see Jake, and then I'm going to the shelter. Sophia, you don't have to do this. We can talk about it, figure out something that works for both of us." "No, David. We can't." She set the dress on his desk. "Thank you for everything. Tell Mrs. Patterson I said goodbye." David followed her to the front door, watching helplessly as she climbed into the waiting taxi. As it pulled away, he stood on his marble steps, the same steps where this had all begun, and felt like his world was ending all over again. He'd found love in the most unexpected place, and he'd lost it the same way he'd lost everything else. By trying too hard to hold on, by confusing control with care, by believing that his resources could solve problems that required something much simpler and much more complicated than money. The house felt empty again, but this time the silence wasn't peaceful. It was accusatory, echoing with everything he'd said wrong and everything he'd failed to understand. David Morrison, who could negotiate billion-dollar deals and command boardrooms full of powerful men, had been defeated by his own good intentions and a pregnant woman's fierce independence. And somewhere across the city, Sophia was about to face the man who'd started all of this, carrying David's heart along with his nephew's child. The photography studio was smaller than Sophia had expected, tucked between a coffee shop and a vintage clothing store in a part of downtown that gentrification hadn't quite reached yet. Through the large front window, she could see exposed brick walls lined with black and white portraits. Couples, families, children frozen in moments of joy that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Sophia sat in the cab for 5 minutes after it stopped, her hands pressed against her belly as Alexander, she'd started thinking of him by name, kicked restlessly. Her son seemed to sense her anxiety, his movements more urgent than usual. "You sure about this, lady?" the driver asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "You look like you're about to have that baby right here in my back seat." "I'm sure," Sophia said, though she wasn't sure about anything except that she needed to do this herself, on her own terms. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and Sophia heard a familiar voice call out from the back room. "I'll be right with you." Jake's voice. After 8 months, it still made her heart skip. Not with love anymore, but with the muscle memory of love, the ghost of what she'd thought they had. When he emerged from the darkroom, wiping his hands on a towel, his face went through the same progression of emotions she'd seen that night he'd learned about the pregnancy. Shock, recognition, and something that might have been panic. "Sophia." He looked exactly the same, dark hair falling into green eyes, that crooked smile that had charmed her from the first day they'd met. But now she could see what she'd missed before. The restlessness in his posture, the way his eyes kept darting toward the exit, as if he was always calculating escape routes. "Hello, Jake." They stared at each other across the small studio space, 3 feet and 8 months of silence between them. Sophia had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now that it was happening, all her carefully planned words seemed inadequate. "You look." Jake gestured vaguely at her obvious pregnancy. "You look good. Healthy. Thank you. How did you find me? Does it matter?" Jake set down the towel and ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she remembered from their time together. "Look, Sophia, I know what you must think of me." "Do you?" she interrupted. "Because I'm not sure I know what to think of you anymore. I panicked, okay? When you told me about the baby, I wasn't ready. I'm still not ready." Sophia nodded slowly. "I know. Your plane ticket to Portland is for Thursday." Jake's face went pale. "How did you?" "It doesn't matter how I know. What matters is that you were going to leave without saying goodbye. Again." "I was going to send you money," Jake said quickly. "I've been saving up. I was going to make sure you were taken care of." "With what money?" "You work part-time at a photography studio." Jake's jaw tightened. "I have other resources. Your family's money. It's complicated." Sophia moved deeper into the studio, studying the photographs on the walls. They were good, better than good. Jake had real talent behind the camera, an eye for capturing authentic emotion. It made his deception hurt even more, knowing that this creative, sensitive person was real while everything else about him had been a lie. "These are beautiful," she said, stopping in front of a portrait of an elderly couple holding hands. "You have a gift." "Thank you." Jake's voice was cautious, as if he was trying to figure out where this conversation was heading. "Is this what you really want to do?" "Photography. Yes. It's the only thing I've ever been good at that wasn't handed to me." Sophia turned to face him. "Then why didn't you tell me? Why did you have to lie about everything else?" Jake slumped against the counter, suddenly looking younger than his 24 years. "Because Jake Morrison, the real Jake Morrison, is a disappointment to everyone who matters. His father thinks he's wasting his potential. His uncle thinks he's ungrateful. He can't live up to the family name, and he can't escape it either. So you became someone else. I became who I wanted to be. Someone without all the baggage and expectations." Jake looked up at her, his green eyes bright with unshed tears. "When I was with you, I could pretend I was just a regular guy who happened to fall in love with an amazing woman. But you couldn't sustain the pretense. I tried. God, Sophia, I tried. But when you told me about the baby," Jake's voice cracked, "I knew I couldn't fake being ready for that. I couldn't pretend to be the kind of man who could be a good father when I don't even know how to be a good son." Sophia felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Jake wasn't a monster. He was just a scared young man who'd been running from himself for so long that he'd forgotten how to stand still. "Your uncle has been looking for you," she said quietly. Jake's head snapped up. "David? How do you know about David?" "Because I've been staying with him." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake stared at her as if she'd just announced she'd been living on Mars. "You've been staying with my Uncle David?" "David Morrison." "Yes. The billionaire David Morrison who hasn't spoken to my father in 3 years and who had security throw me out of his building." "The same one." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This is insane. How did you even meet him? I collapsed outside his building. He took me to the hospital. Sophia paused, then decided on complete honesty. I was wearing Jessica's bracelet, the one you gave me. He recognized it. Jake's face went ashen. Oh God, Sophia, I never meant for you to get caught up in all this family drama. I wanted you to have something beautiful, and that bracelet was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. It belonged to your cousin, your dead cousin. I love Jessica, Jake said fiercely. She was like a little sister to me before everything went to hell between David and my father. When she died, I wanted something to remember her by. So you took her bracelet and gave it to me with a lie about it belonging to your sister. I didn't know what else to say. I couldn't tell you the truth about my family without telling you the truth about myself. Sophia moved to the window, looking out at the busy street. People walked by with purpose, heading to jobs and homes and lives that made sense to them. She envied them their certainty. David wants to help, she said. He wants to make things right. Of course he does. That's what Morrisons do. We throw money at problems until they go away. Is that what you think I am? A problem to be solved. Jake was quiet for a long moment. No. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. That's why I had to leave. Sophia turned back to him. That doesn't make any sense. Doesn't it? Look at me, Sophia. Really look. I'm 24 years old. I work part-time jobs to avoid taking money from my family, and I've been lying about who I am since the day we met. What kind of father would I be? The kind who learns as he goes. The kind who tries. And what if I screw it up? What if I turn out like my father, all bitter and controlling? What if I turn out like David, all successful and empty? What if I can't be what you and the baby need? Sophia studied Jake's face, seeing the genuine terror there. He wasn't running because he didn't care. He was running because he cared too much and didn't trust himself not to fail. You know what I think, she said. What? I think you're a coward. Jake flinched as if she'd slapped him. But I also think you're a coward who loves me. And I think you're scared of our baby because you want to be a good father so desperately that you've convinced yourself you can't be. Sophia, I'm not finished. Her voice was strong now, certain. I think you took that bracelet because you wanted to give me something that mattered, and I think you've been saving money to send me because you want to take care of us even if you can't be with us. Jake was crying now, tears streaming down his face without shame. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I left you. I'm so sorry I lied. I'm so sorry I'm such a mess. I'm sorry too, Sophia said softly. I'm sorry I wasn't someone you felt safe enough to tell the truth to. I'm sorry your family is so complicated that you felt like you had to escape it. I'm sorry we couldn't figure out how to be honest with each other. What happens now? Jake asked. Sophia felt Alexander kick, strong and insistent, reminding her that whatever happened next, she wasn't just making decisions for herself anymore. Now you have a choice, she said. You can get on that plane Thursday and spend the rest of your life wondering what kind of man you could have been. Or you can stay and find out. And if I stay, what then? Then we figure it out together. Not as the people we pretended to be, but as the people we actually are. Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I don't know how to be a Morrison without all the baggage. Then maybe it's time to figure out how to be a Morrison differently. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the studio in golden light that made even the most ordinary moments look like something worth photographing. Sophia felt her son moving restlessly, as if he too was waiting to see what his father would choose. For the first time in 8 months, Jake Morrison had to decide who he really wanted to be. 3 weeks later, Sophia's labor pains started at 3:47 a.m. in the small apartment she'd rented above a bakery, 15 minutes from David's estate and 20 minutes from Jake's photography studio. She'd been living there for 2 weeks, slowly building a life that was entirely her own. Modest but real, independent but not isolated. She called Jake first, then David, then sat on her couch breathing through contractions while she waited for them to arrive. The apartment was tiny but warm, filled with second-hand furniture and baby clothes she'd bought with her own money from the part-time bookkeeping job Jake had helped her find. Jake arrived within 10 minutes, carrying the camera bag he took everywhere and looking terrified. David appeared 5 minutes later with his driver, his composed businessman facade barely concealing his panic. "How far apart are the contractions?" Jake asked, kneeling beside the couch. "About 6 minutes now," Sophia managed between breaths. "We should go to the hospital," David said, already reaching for his phone. "I'll call ahead, make sure they have everything ready." "David," Sophia interrupted gently. "I've already called. Dr. Martinez is expecting us. We just need to drive me there like normal people." David looked like he wanted to argue, but Jake caught his eye and shook his head slightly. Over the past 3 weeks, the two men had been learning to navigate their complicated relationship, not just as uncle and nephew, but as two people who loved the same woman and her unborn child. Jake had canceled his plane ticket the day after their conversation in the studio. He'd also called his father for the first time in 6 months, had a long overdue conversation with David about their family's fractured dynamics, and started attending therapy to work through years of identity issues and fear of commitment. He wasn't magically transformed. Real change took time, but he was trying. And for Sophia, trying was enough to build on. The drive to the hospital was a study in controlled chaos. Jake held Sophia's hand in the back seat, while David gave the driver increasingly urgent directions from the front seat. Thomas, who had been David's driver for 15 years, ignored his boss's back seat, driving with practiced patience. "Alexander Morrison Kim is going to be born," Sophia said during a break between contractions, and both men turned to look at her. "Morrison Kim?" David asked. "I want him to know both sides of his heritage," Sophia explained. "The complicated Morrison legacy he's inheriting, and the fact that he comes from people who survived impossible things." Jake squeezed her hand. "Are you sure about the Morrison part? Given everything that name comes with." "I'm sure. But we're going to teach him to carry it differently than the rest of you have." Alexander Morrison Kim entered the world at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with dark hair like his father and brown eyes like his mother. His first act was to grab Jake's finger when it was offered, holding on with surprising strength. "He knows you," Sophia whispered, exhausted but radiant. Jake was crying openly, staring down at his son with wonder. "He's perfect. He's absolutely perfect." David stood slightly apart, giving the new family their moment while struggling with emotions he wasn't sure he had names for. This tiny person represented so many things: hope, redemption, the continuation of a family name that had been tarnished by years of pride and miscommunication. "Would you like to hold him?" Sophia asked David. David's hands trembled as the nurse placed Alexander in his arms. The baby was so small, so fragile, but also so undeniably present. A new life that demanded nothing more than love and protection. "Hello, Alexander," David said softly. "I'm your Uncle David. I've been waiting to meet you." As if responding to his voice, Alexander opened his eyes and seemed to focus on David's face. In that moment, David felt something shift fundamentally inside himself. For 3 years, he'd been living with the end of his story. The loss of his family, the failure of his relationships, the isolation of his success. But holding his nephew's son, seeing the way Jake looked at Sophia and the baby with fierce protective love, David realized this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Over the next few hours, the hospital room filled with flowers. Not just from David's connections, but from Jake's co-workers at the studio, from Sophia's new employer, from Mrs. Patterson, who had appointed herself the baby's honorary grandmother. Robert arrived that evening, looking older than David remembered, but softening immediately when he saw his grandson. The brothers stood on opposite sides of Sophia's bed, watching Jake change Alexander's diaper with the focused concentration of someone tackling the most important task in the world. "He's going to be a good father," Robert said quietly. "Yes, he is," David agreed. "I was too hard on him growing up, trying so hard not to raise him the way we were raised that I went too far the other way." David glanced at his brother. "We both made mistakes." "Yeah, but you're getting a second chance. Jake told me about your conversation, about how you've been helping Sophia. Thank you for that. She didn't need my help as much as I needed to give it. Robert smiled, the first genuine smile David had seen from him in years. That sounds like something Dad would have said. God, I hope not. Dad would have tried to buy the hospital and rename it after himself. Both brothers laughed, and Jake looked up from the diaper bag. Are you two actually having a civil conversation? Stranger things have happened, David said. Not many, but some. 3 days later, they brought Alexander home. Not to David's mansion, but to Sophia's small apartment, where everything was ready for his arrival. David had wanted to insist they stay at the estate, but he was learning to offer support without overwhelming, to help without taking over. Jake had moved into the apartment the week before, after he and Sophia had long conversations about expectations, honesty, and what they both needed from a relationship built on truth instead of fantasy. They weren't married. That was a conversation for later, when they both had time to become the people they wanted to be. But they were committed to raising their son together and figuring out love as they went. I have something for you, David said as they settled Alexander into his crib. A simple white crib that Sophia had picked out herself, paid for with her own money, assembled by Jake with only minimal cursing. He pulled out a small wrapped box and handed it to Sophia. Inside was Jessica's bracelet. Not the one Jake had given her, but a different one, with tiny silver stars instead of hearts. This was Jessica's too, David explained. She got it for her 16th birthday. I thought maybe you could wear it when Alexander is old enough to ask about his family. So you could tell him about his cousin who would have loved him. Sophia's eyes filled with tears as she fastened the bracelet around her wrist. It's beautiful. Thank you. There's something else, David continued. I've been thinking about what you said, about helping versus rescuing. I want to set up a college fund for Alexander, but I want to do it right. No strings attached, no conditions, no expectations. Just an uncle who wants his nephew to have choices. Jake looked up from where he was attempting to master the art of swaddling. David, you don't have to. I want to, but only if it's okay with both of you. This is your family, your decisions. Sophia and Jake exchanged a look. One of those wordless conversations that couples have when they're learning to be a team. Okay, Sophia said, but we want to contribute too, even if it's just a little bit each month. Alexander should know that his parents worked for his future too. David nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. The Morrison money would always be there, but it wouldn't define Alexander's worth or his parents' ability to provide for him. As the sun set over the city, David prepared to leave the young family to their first night home together. He paused at the door, looking back at the scene, Jake holding Alexander while Sophia dozed on the couch, both of them looking exhausted but blissfully content. David, Sophia called softly. Thank you. For everything. For finding us, for bringing us together, for letting us figure out our own way. Thank you, David replied, for teaching me the difference between helping and healing. Outside, Thomas was waiting with the car. As they drove back to the estate, David found himself thinking about the future. There would be birthday parties in small apartments instead of mansion ballrooms. There would be awkward family dinners where they all learned to be honest with each other. There would be holidays where Alexander would be surrounded by adults who had all made mistakes but were committed to doing better. It wouldn't be the perfect family that money could buy. It would be something far more valuable, a real family built on choice and commitment and love that had survived truth-telling. When David reached his house, he didn't head straight to his study as he usually did. Instead, he went to the nursery wing, to Jake's old room, and began making plans to turn it into a space where Alexander could stay when he visited his uncle David. Not because Sophia and Jake couldn't provide for their son, but because every child deserved to be surrounded by people who loved them. And because the Morrison family was going to do things differently this time. 6 months later, when Alexander took his first steps, he toddled back and forth between his parents and Sophia's living room while David recorded everything on Jake's professional camera. The video would join hundreds of others in what Mrs. Patterson called Master Alexander's documentary. A record of a child who would grow up knowing exactly how much he was wanted by exactly how many people. And sometimes, when the light was just right, David could swear he saw Jessica's smile and Alexander's laugh, as if she was somehow part of this new beginning too. The Morrison family legacy would continue, but it would be written differently this time, with more truth, more vulnerability, and more love than money could ever buy. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most broken circumstances. David Morrison thought his story ended in tragedy 3 years ago, but what he discovered was that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Sometimes it's a stranger collapsing on your doorstep. Sometimes it's choosing to help when you have every reason to walk away. Sometimes it's learning that the family we create is just as powerful as the family we're born into. Alexander Morrison Kim will grow up knowing he was wanted by not just 2 parents, but by an entire network of people who chose to love him. He'll carry both his mother's strength and his father's creativity, his uncle's generosity and his grandfather's determination to do better. Most importantly, he'll know that real love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, telling the truth, and choosing each other every single day. What does family mean to you? Is it the people you're born to, or the people who choose to stay? Have you ever found love in the most unexpected place? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences inspire future stories. And if this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional journeys that remind us that love really can conquer all. Your next favorite love story is just one click away.